So this is on how to give a opposition closing speech in the online debate format. And the opposition rebuttal and closing speech is 4 minutes long, so it's a minute less than your initial opening speech. But it's twice as long as the proposition closing and is longer than the proposition's rebuttal. So one of the things that had to have happened during the proposition's rebuttal speech is that they had to have dropped some of your arguments because you had 5 minutes and they had 3 minutes. So they had to have not answered everything because they just don't have as much time. So one of the things that you should do in your opposition rebuttal is focus on the arguments that they didn't answer. And if they answered something poorly, that should also be something that you focus on. So maybe they did answer everything because they didn't go into as much depth as you did, and they just gave like one quick answer to everything. Well, focus on one of those arguments and collapse the debate down to that point. All right? So if you remember, like I've made sports analogies and chess analogies with arguments about moving your arguments like pieces or players in order to get something later on. You want to now focus on the player who you're going to score the points with, or the chess pieces that you're going to put your opponent in checkmate with, right? It's now you only need a couple of those initial tools to win the round, but you have to explain why the one you're going for should win you the round. I recommend starting your speech off with, "You will vote for the proposition because," or "You will vote for me because," "I am going to win this debate because," and clearly state the single argument that you think the judge should vote on. Judges will try to the best of their ability to only use the words that you use to make their decision. So you want to pretend that you're actually writing the ballot for the judge and be like, "You will vote for this argument because once we win that eliminating factory farms will cause the destruction of the environment." I heard someone talking about pesticides will cause the extinction of bees. That will be an environmental collapse which will destroy the entirety of the planet. Even if it might be horrific to eat some animals and torture them, the collapse of the entire planet's ecosystem means that everything dies, and that's more important. So once we win this argument, and then I would compare on a utilitarian principle why the number of people who are affected is more important than the individuals who are being sacrificed. I'd give like a 30-second argument on that, and then I would start addressing other elements of the debate. So I'd start with what I wanted to win the round on, and get into depth about that, and then explain why that wins you the round, and then go on to other things in the debate. So just like I said in the opposition opening speech, you start with your offense and then you get to your defense. That's also very much true in the opposition rebuttal and closing. While it says rebuttal and closing, you should think of bookending your speech. So it starts with why you win the round, and it ends by returning to the point of why you win the round in relation to everything you've sort of answered in the middle. So a good opposition rebuttal closing generally is offense, defense, offense. So that way the judge has in their mind when they're adjudicating the round the first words that you were saying for why you win the round, then watched you having debated it out by going through all the defensive arguments, and then it concludes with also having in their mind why you should win as a result of how you wrap up and close your speech. Okay? Yep.
Oh wait, this is a question about proposition. But am I allowed to go back to a point that my opponent never responded to in my opening, in the last video, or am I only allowed to do that in the first rebuttal?
You should, anytime that they do not answer an argument, you should bring it up again and again.
All right. I was saving it more for tomorrow. Can I still bring it up? Like he never.
You could still bring it up, but how much the judge wants to weigh it if it's not something that's been a consistent thread is sort of up to the judge and how well you connect those points. My suggestion would be that you should connect it back to something that you said sort of in the middle, so that way it doesn't seem like you entirely disregarded it, but you were talking about it in the rebuttal speech. So now in your closing speech, it's just a consistent thread, doing more work explaining why it wins you the round, right? Chances are you said something in the vein of what you're talking about in your middle speech. So just draw the lines when you explain, like in my rebuttal speech, I said such and such and such. Therefore, and then make the argument that it morphs into. All right, and that's true with on the opposition rebuttal and closing speech as well. Is that you could morph words that you said in your opening in order to make arguments have a little bit more nuance than initially comes out with. Like if you made factory farms destroy the environment and localitarianism solves that, if that was your generic starting point, in your rebuttal and closing, that could turn into a more specific scenario about like about like runoffs or pesticides, or make it more specific into whatever it is in order to make it seem like they're not answering it, because you're adding another level of depth based upon how you're bringing that argument to this next stage. Okay, yep.
Oh, we can use counterplan as a proposition too, right?
No, a counterplan is only on the opposition side, because a counterplan is when you propose a different method to the proposition.
Oh, because what I said was like, she said that there's too many pesticides being used, so then I was like, why not eat meat and have control on pesticides?
That would be more like a permutation, saying that we could do these things simultaneously together, right? So their idea of not using pesticides is not mutually exclusive with getting rid of factory farms, and the permutation is we should do it together, regulate pesticides and get rid of the factory farms, right? So that, yeah, and I can see why you say that you said that as a counterplan, because it's almost like it's another advocacy for what you're doing to solve something, but it's a testing the competitiveness of it to see if the counterplan is opportunity cost to yours. Yep.
What if you said that, I got the pesticide argument too, what if you said that if you started growing exclusively crops and not meat, you wouldn't need the pesticides per se, because you'd be able to keep up with the population growth and be able to feed people, and they wouldn't have as much of a need to protect their crops?
Right, yeah, you could definitely make that argument, right? And so, like, in your opposition rebuttal, you definitely have to focus on the other team's arguments and answer like specific scenarios. If they're talking about pesticides, or if they're talking about anything else, you want to make sure that you have answers on those arguments. But just because you beat back something like pesticides or beat back one of their individual scenarios, that doesn't mean that you'll be able to win the entirety of the debate round. Just because you don't lose on that round. So you don't want to have that as sort of the centerpiece of it. So on the opposition rebuttal, if you did a counterplan on your opposition side, that's something that's strong that you could lead with, because part of your analysis should be, we solve for the entirety of what the proposition wants, but the one difference is this. All I have to show you is that these two things, our opposition and their proposition, can't be done at the same time or isn't desirable, and we will win this round. And then I would get to the specific arguments about how my counterplan solved the proposition's argument and why they couldn't be done simultaneously, right? So I start with why the counterplan wins, then I explain the answers for why I don't lose on the responses that they've given to my counterplan. And if you ran disads, you want to focus on the impact portion of your disadvantage first. Like, what is the impact to the economy of getting rid of all factory farms, right? I heard someone talking about that will collapse the economy, that will cause war, because when depression happens, people will go to war in order to increase their economy again. So if that's the impact, then I'd be like, the magnitude of the war they're going to cause because they've eliminated factory farms and killed the economy will create a global nuclear exchange between major economic players like China and the United States and Russia, which will collapse the entirety of the planet. The magnitude of that is 100% because everything dies. So even if the probability might be a little bit less than we know factory farms are bad, that probability is outweighed by total extinction. It's better to, avoid a 50% chance of extinction than allowing a couple of animals to be tortured. And so you would do that sort of weighing as a result of it, right? So even a lot of disadvantages function on a sort of mini-max theory. Despite a minimum risk, because the impact is maximum, right? Global nuclear exchange that results in extinction. That's not worth the higher probability and greater and smaller magnitude, right? So if you remember what I've talked about in like impact comparison debates, time frame, probability, and magnitude. If you have a disadvantage, make that impact big enough where if you win that disadvantage, it outweighs anything that the proposition is going to solve for. And if you start with that, and you're like, even if the proposition solves for 100% of their arguments, and even if you think that it is morally disgusting for us to eat animals, and even if factory farms are going to destroy the environment over a 20-year time frame, it doesn't matter, because the crash of the economy that will happen as soon as factory farms go out of business will immediately send us in a spiral of economic depression that will result in global nuclear exchange that will destroy the entirety of the planet. And then it would explain the basis of sort of utilitarian principles versus whatever the impacts there are. So if they're talking about animal rights, I would then explain utilitarian why if everyone dies, it also kills the animals in the factory farms, and death by nuclear weapons is not just a peaceful death, it's oftentimes slow and agonizing because of radiation, so there's also torture that's involved within it as well, and the end point is that those animals die also. And so I've done direct weighing of those impacts, and you should lead with something like that regardless of what your disadvantage is or your counterplan is. You lead with why it wins you the round in comparison to that to the affirmative team. So even if it's up 100%, You still vote for the opposition because, and after you do that, then go to, and it's not morally disgusting to eat meat, and you give your responses to that specific advantage, right? That defense. So that way you also are decreasing the probability so they don't get that 100% risk if they're small magnitude. Yep.
What the ones were on the proposition, my opposition tried using like basically an alternative that if everybody became vegetarians, then spreading the pesticides would basically end the world.
Mm-hmm.
And my rebuttal to that was that global warming is more of a threat to the end of the world than pesticides. So my environmental argument should supersede their pesticide argument. Is that?
Yeah, that's an example of Wayne. So like sometimes like global nuclear war versus animal rights are different impacts. Sometimes the impacts are the same, environmental collapse. So then you have to weigh which environmental collapse scenario is more specific. So pesticides killing bees. Bees are oftentimes a keystone species. If they go down, then there's nothing to pollinate. If nothing gets pollinated, then the world collapses.
Right.
And you're like global warming, right? If it gets too hot, we will also die. What has quicker time frames? What has greater probability? But comparing global warming and pesticides and which one is the more realistic extinction scenario would also rely, like it's the same magnitude because it's both ecological collapse, but the time frame and probability of both is then what gets debated over that one.
Right.
Yep.
I'm the proposition, and in my opposition's opening, he argued a procedural argument, and he didn't do anything else besides that. So once I support myself that there is no voting issue, he can't make any new arguments.
Right. If the only argument someone gives is a procedural argument, you just have to beat that procedural argument. And you should tell the judge that once I have proven that what I've done isn't unfair or isn't bad for education, I've won the round because they don't contest any of my other points. And then I'd make them again, quickly, but I'd only spend like, maybe 30 seconds because it's all conceded. And I would just remind the judge, it's all conceded, don't allow new any arguments. They only have this procedural argument. Now, if you're going to go for a procedural argument in your opposition closing, it should be at least 50% of your speech, because judges don't like to vote on, oh, you went over by 10 seconds, or oh, your video was a little choppy, right? Like, they would rather vote on substance than like a procedural rule, but they will vote in the procedural rule if you do the work for it. So you have to, when you debate procedurals, you have to make it be the education that procedural debates are. And for anyone who's interested in law, procedural debates are closest to what people do in legal argumentation, is that they present other cases that show why this decision would be fair or unfair given the circumstances and the facts. And so if you get into how debate is better structured for education and fairness based upon the way that rounds could look outside of this individual round, then it becomes a more full argument that you can actually get a judge to vote on. Yeah?
For my opposition, I just did a straight procedural, but it wasn't just on one point. Like my opponent, she kind of broke two rules and then inconvenienced me to like a far point. Like she didn't make her video public until 7:30 at night, and that gave me. She even said like he still has 6 hours to do it, but that's only a fourth of the time.
Right. So you had a couple of procedural arguments.
Yeah, and also, are we giving a 30-second grace period? Because that's what she said. She went over time by 20 seconds and was spreading. And I pointed that out. How it's unfair and.
In previous versions of the tournament, which means that she's probably competed in previous versions of the tournament, like there was an explicit 30-second grace period. But then that grace period was always debated about, and then always, sometimes people would go 33 seconds and then there'd be a debate over that. Sometimes people just argued against the grace period. So it's always been sort of up to the discretion of the judge. So like if she explains why a 30-second grace period is good, which was to allow people to finish their thoughts.
But she just said that there's a grace period, so.
Yeah.
She should be allowed to.
Well, I would say it seems like you have different procedural arguments. So in any case, in your last rebuttal and closing, I would not go for each one of the procedural arguments, but I would go for one of the violations. So in the same way I tell people to collapse like their disadvantages or counterplans down to fewer and fewer arguments, for your procedural argument, you should collapse down to one of the violations, the one you think is the worst. And then the other ones you could be like, that compounds this individual problem that makes, it uniquely problematic, but this is the one that you should vote against her. The other ones might have just been okay if they happen, independent, but this one is something that we have to make sure doesn't happen in future debates because of the way it affects the education and the fairness, and then explain why the judge should uphold that sort of education and fairness, right? So if you started with just a procedural, that is all you could go for at the end. But if you started with a couple of different violations, you could go for one of those violations and not necessarily all of them. The same way people won't necessarily always go for the environment and the local farming and the economy. They'll pick one of those. You pick one of your violations, and then make sure that you do enough work explaining for why it's worth voting on. So start with your offense. Judge, you will vote for me because this procedural violation is so egregious that it will destroy the way that these online competitions take place, negating any of its value. Even if her proposition is a good idea in abstract, because of the way the debate was structured, it became impossible to debate that out whether or not it was good or bad. All right. So whatever your argument is, there's a way to phrase it offensively, but there's also a way to just, not phrase it offensively. You're just like, well, they'll hurt some bees, or, well, they did something that was unfair. If you just leave it at that, it's not a strong enough argument for judges to vote on. So don't give the judge options to vote on. Tell the judge what they should vote on, right? And so there's a big difference between those two things. Like, you might have a bunch of arguments, and you can see why any of these individual arguments win you the round, and the judge might as well. But who's ever clearer at explaining why they should win the round directly will be the team that oftentimes wins that round. Okay? I would also, in this speech, in the rebuttal portion of it, this is your opportunity to compare citations if you didn't do it before. This is your opportunity to go to one of their sources and say, this is a sentence that actually disproves the way that they're interpreting this piece of evidence. So because it's not just a closing speech for the opposition side, in that defensive period, the middle period of the debate, you should be doing evidence challenges, explaining why our evidence is better than their evidence, explaining why their evidence isn't as good as they think it is, as part of the arguments that you have, which can include, remember, the date that it was written. Are they reading old evidence about environmental destruction or not? This is where you should make the arguments that they don't give me citations, which means that's a reason for why you should prefer our evidence, even if they might be legitimate. We can't test this, so you should not give us the opportunity for doing that. And this is also where you should remind the judge that anything that they don't answer, they should remember, because the proposition has the final word. So you want to tell the judge anything that's not answered or anything that they screwed up on, and tell the judge they don't make any of these other arguments that they think they're making. Like, so be like, they don't give a response to it, so don't let them get up and say something else. Or if you think that they gave a bad response, you should tell the judge the proposition only says, quote, end quote. Don't allow any new responses, and don't let that turn into something else. This is what they said. My answers to this one argument that they give in response are, and then you make it clear for the judge what that is. So it's basically you're telling the judge, these are the notes of exactly what they said. Don't let it change. Here are my responses. At that point, we win the debate. So you try and hold the proposition to what they actually said, because it will be frustrating for you on the opposition side, and always is, listening to that last proposition speech that will include arguments that they didn't make earlier, that will include the way that they morph and twist their words, right? In the same way I'm suggesting that you should have that skill, other people suggest having that skill, so they will do that. And a good proposition will win rounds on arguments that aren't necessarily clear in their initial rebuttal speech, because they'll be able to elaborate a lot more and collapse just that individual thing, right? Because it's sort of, if you were playing poker, it's the opposition has to show the proposition of their cards before the proposition makes that final bet. The proposition has an advantage because as on the proposition side, you know why the opposition wanted to win the round. So you have a full day to think about why they shouldn't win the round in that way, using whatever you want and figuring out how to twist your words. So there's a definite side advantage of being proposition in that sense. So as the opposition, you have to check against that by explaining how those sort of things shouldn't happen, so you don't get frustrated by the judge voting on something that was sort of different. Okay? Any questions? Okay. So then at that point you could post your speech, and